Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark from Living by Mark Szczepura. The book I will review today is The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion with a leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you're interested. Now let's get back to the review. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion is a 1956 Japanese novel written by Yukio Mishima. Mishima was somewhat of an eccentric figure in Japan. He was hailed as one of the greatest Japanese literary talents, and his books enjoy constant popularity. But I myself have some reservations about Mishima's writing style. I find him more interesting as an individual. He was a bit of a paradox, an intellectual giant obsessed with physical beauty, conservative and political sympathizer of the extreme right, but admirer of Western liberal values, and a homosexual samurai who committed traditional suicide. There are quite a few works about Mishima. I myself really enjoyed the 1985 biographical film titled Mishima Live in 4 Chapters, where the first part is based on the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Okay, now the book. What is the Temple of the Golden Pavilion about? It is about destructive obsession motivated by inner complexes and insecurities, and it analytically and at the same time poetically paints a downward slide into the dark hole of schizophrenia. It is imagination versus reality, and rarely the second wins over the first, and it doesn't in this book. The novel is inspired by the real events of the destruction of the 14th century Buddhist temple in Kyoto by a mentally unstable monk. For those who don't like spoilers, the burning of the temple is a well-known fact and a rather predictable ending, so the book is not really about the destruction of the Golden Temple, but about the complex road that led to it. Mishima was influenced by Dostoevsky, and I think he considered him his favorite writer. And there seems to be some impact of Crime and Punishment on the Temple of the Golden Pavilion. But the difference is that the punishment comes before the crime, and the actual crime carries a personal reward of inner liberation as opposed to inner suffering in Crime and Punishment. Okay, a bit of the plot. The story takes place in Kyoto in the 1940s, and the main character and narrator is a youth named Mizoguchi, who is the son of a poor Buddhist monk. As a child, Mizoguchi began to stutter, which transformed him into a social outcast. His father describes and tells him stories about the Golden Temple, and later takes him there to start his apprenticeship to become a monk. The temple has an instant effect on Mizoguchi, and he starts to fantasize about it being bombed by the Americans and burned. Since this part of the book takes place during the period of the intense military activity in the Pacific during World War II. In the temple, Mizoguchi also makes his first friend, Tsurukawa, and later, when he transfers to the university, he befriends a club-footed manipulator named Kashiwagi, who starts to interfere with his old friendship with Tsurukawa, and this leads to somewhat of a tragic end to the relationship. As the time passes, Mizoguchi's mental health starts to deteriorate, and he starts to make some questionable decisions, such as borrowing money, traveling unexpectedly, and spending his tuition funds on questionable entertainment. Also, he devises a destructive plan for the temple and himself but due to some personal obstacles and doubts, he struggles with the execution of it. And that's the basic plot. What do I think about the Temple of the Golden Pavilion? The book is beautifully written, which is true for most of the Japanese novels. However, in the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, as with all of Mishima's writings, the prose occasionally is infected by the Western, specifically American style, which I find a bit annoying. It could be a translation problem, but I don't think that's the case. I read a few other Japanese writers, and the earlier writings seem to be unpolluted and original. The reason behind the change might be that Mishima was one of the first post-war Japanese writers, and those early years, when Japan has been under American occupation, have injected a lot of Americanisms into the Japanese culture, and this left a mark on their literature present until today. The best example of it are Murakami's novels, which seem to make an effort to be American-like, and maybe that's why they are so popular there. But to me, sometimes the writing comes across as stiff and unoriginal. I prefer somebody like Kobo Abe, who came from the same post-war generation, but was able to maintain in his writings more of the Japanese originality. But that's my personal pet peeve. Anyway, the main character in the Temple of the Golden Pavilion is Mizoguchi, who is loosely based on Yoken Hayashi, a young Buddhist monk who burned the Golden Temple. Until today, there is a lot of speculation about the reason behind Hayashi's act, since the only hint left by him is a statement where he said he didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Mishima has done extensive research on the subject, going as far as visiting Hayashi in prison, but probably didn't get much information about the event out of him, since Hayashi was rather reserved, which being a Buddhist monk is not a surprise. I find Mishima's approach to writing the novel somewhat similar to Truman Capote's in Cold Blood, but where Capote is stuck to true crime, Mishima opted to fictionalize the story, which might have been caused by the lack of collaboration from Hayashi. On the surface, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion is about poetic obsession with art and beauty, but the unnamed underlying foundation for the whole story is schizophrenia, and its degenerating impact on Mizoguchi, which was caused or aggravated by his stuttering. And it is rooted in Mishima's own lifelong schizophrenic behavior. Mizoguchi fixates on the Golden Temple as the source and reason for his suffering. He sees it as a controlling force over his life and uses the excuse of undeserving beauty for wanting to see it destroyed. For him, modern Japan doesn't deserve the timeless beauty of the Golden Temple, and this is motivated by his personal hate of the contemporary society, which he considers corrupted and lacking in values. Mizoguchi's discontent increases gradually as he observes different episodes transpiring around him, such as early infidelity of his mother, the Japanese woman allowing herself to be disrespected by the American soldier, and repeated breaking of the Buddhist vows by the temple's Father Superior. Another motive for his growing vexation was caused by what he considered the Japanese government's discrimination against Buddhism. During World War II, the preferred religion was Shinto, which was a purely political decision, since Shinto was considered a national religion and unifying force, contrary to Buddhism, which came from China, Japan's enemy at that time. Mizoguchi's discontent represents Mishima's own feelings about post-war Japan. His actions, such as failed coup to restore the imperial government, and his following of the samurai's Bushido code reflect his own high appreciation for the traditional and deception with modern Japan. But I think all of these negative sentiments were rooted in Mishima's deep feelings of self-guilt and inferiority complex going back to his childhood, and also being rejected for the military service during the war as physically unfit, which later created his obsession with the physical body and health. And further, there were other personal demons which Mishima was fighting, such as his closet homosexuality. All of this led to the creation of various literary protagonists who are destructive and have a death wish, such as Mizoguchi. I might be focusing a bit too much on Mishima, but the Temple of the Golden Pavilion reflects deeply on Mishima's own psychology. He said, "Human life is limited, but I would like to live forever." The destruction of the temple in the novel had a liberating impact on Mizoguchi, something Mishima himself searched for but never found. His own golden temple burning was an attempt at overthrowing of the Japanese government, but it failed. So for Mishima there was no liberation and no reason to continue. Mizoguchi's inner struggle is controlled by the exterior forces pulling him in contradictory directions, such as the two friends he makes. First, there is Tsurukawa, who has a sentimental and somewhat positive impact on Mizoguchi, and then there is Kashiwagi, who is analytical and manipulative and can be considered a negative influence, but the differences are not very clear. Kashiwagi shows Mizoguchi an alternate, more confident way of dealing with one's handicap, and this probably emboldened him to take action. For me, partial guilt or inspiration for Mizoguchi's act of destruction lies in Buddhism itself, or his own interpretation of it. When before his deed he recites this Zen mantra: "When you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. When you meet your ancestor, kill your ancestor. When you meet a disciple of Buddha, kill the disciple. When you meet your father and mother, kill your father and mother. When you meet your kin, kill your kin. Only thus will you attain deliverance. Only thus will you escape the trammels of material things and become free." That's the problem caused by all religions when the quotes are taken literally and out of context. And that's what Mizoguchi does by treating his Vandal action as an act of spiritual initiation, and in the book he goes as far as to equate it to losing his virginity. To sum it up, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, besides being a bit of a psychological realism, can also be considered a somewhat compelling love story that turns into destructive obsession. Mizoguchi transfers his unreturned affections onto an object which eventually he doesn't want to share with anybody. And his destructive plan is further motivated and even triggered when he's told by the temple abbot that he will never replace him, thus never consummate metaphorically his relationship with the Golden Temple. So Mizoguchi comes to a decision so common in tragic romances: if I cannot have it, nobody will. But I think the actual reason in this sad tale is that the real world doesn't live up to Mizoguchi's fantasy. There is the initial disappointment by the appearance of the real temple compared to the image Mizoguchi created based on his father's description of it. And he wants it destroyed so it won't shadow the perfection of his imaginary world. When his wish is not carried by the American bombers, he starts a long search for justification to do it himself. Misoguchi destroyed the Golden Temple physically, but he considered it an act of liberation for himself and the temple. The real temple was rebuilt a few years later, and we can assume that Misoguchi would not be happy about it, since the temple represented his previous unhappy life. However, Mishima himself might have felt differently about it, since the temple represented Japan that was no longer there, and he wanted that Japan back. But ironically, it was Mishima, well together with modern Japan, who unintentionally destroyed the symbolism of the Golden Temple by popularizing it and turning it into another tourist trap. For me personally, besides the before-mentioned bits of foreign pollution in Mishima's writing style, the novel contains a bit too much self-rambling. There isn't much dialogue, but mostly inner, introspective monologues and some spoken out loud monologues. But to be fair, the book is about schizophrenia, which is marked by overanalyzing of the events in one's own life. The novel can be difficult to comprehend, so some external references can be helpful. I sometimes like to see some visual interpretations of the books I read in the form of film adaptations. And for Japanese literature, there is no better one than the Japanese cinema. In the case of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, there is a 1958 film called Enjo, or Conflagration in English, and I think Mishima was involved in the production of it himself. And the film does a pretty decent job of interpreting the book. There is also a previously mentioned American autobiographical film titled Mishima Live in 4 Chapters, which includes great photography and music and has some references to the Golden Temple. But it is more about Mishima's own life and its tragic end. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback, which I transform into a hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, which what I did here. I took an ink drawing of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and put it onto the leather, and also added the title in the Japanese and the English, and it came out pretty nice. The back, I put a little description of the story, and that's the cover. Okay, then I take the copy of the paperback and I add wood boards to the front and the back of the cover, as you can see here, and I reinforce the spine with cotton cords, which you can see if you open the book. And I also add book ends to the book ends, since without them the book seems a bit naked. And I cover everything with cloth tape. I also reinforce the inside of the book with the same cloth tape, and sometimes I can go into a second page if the book needs it, which this one didn't. Next, I dye the leather with leather inks, and I cover the outside and the inside of the book with it. Instead of glue, I sew the cover with thick cord, which to me looks nicer and gives the book more quality. Also, I can print something on the inside, as I have done here. This is an excerpt from the book, but I can print something personal as well. Now, I will make maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So, if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So, if you want one, don't snooze, or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.